In this video, I'm going to show you one of the most effective ways to make your drawings more realistic. I'm going to show you how to shade. Now, a lot of people think shading is really complicated. It's not. I'm going to break it down into 3 easy steps that are both easy to remember and easy to apply. Let's go. Before we get started, let me just say something about materials. If you don't have a whole bunch of fancy pencils, don't worry about it. You're not going to need them to shade. I'm just going to be using one pencil for this demonstration. No matter what pencil you use, you do need to be able to practice drawing 5 different shades. Draw this box with 5 squares in it. Fill it in from lightest to darkest, and try to make them equally spaced apart. We're going to call the lightest shade number 1. That's your highlight. 2, 3, and 4 get darker and darker. They're the mid-tone grays. I happen to be making these shades with an H pencil. H stands for hard. It's 1 step harder than an HB pencil, but any pencil will do. Number 5 will be reserved for areas that receive almost no light. And when I say any pencil will do, let me show you. Now I'm going to take a 6B pencil. That's a very soft pencil. And I'm going to make those same 5 shapes and label them 1 through 5. The difference here is that with the 6B pencil, the soft pencil, it's much harder to control the amount of graphite going onto the page at the 1 and the 2 square, but it's much easier in the 4 and the 5. Before you move on to the shading exercises, I really highly recommend that you try these 5 square exercises with various pencils so you get very comfortable with line weight. It's called variable pressure in drawing. Now we're ready for step 1. You don't actually need your pencil for this. Good drawing starts with observation. Step 1 is locating your light source. A light source in drawing is exactly as it sounds. It is the source of the light. That might be a candle, a flashlight, it might be a lamp, or if you're outside, it's probably the sun. Once you locate the light source, think about where it is in relation to your object. You see, as I move the flashlight around, the egg is lit differently. So take special note, is the flashlight above the egg, on the side, or even underneath? And look at how it changes the shading. Where's the bright spot? Where are the darkest areas of the egg? These are the things that you want to observe. Let's look for those 2 things with this book. Because I'm holding the book flat to the light source, there's no real part that's closest, or you could say that the whole cover is closest to the light source. Also, you'll notice that the book is facing the light source. Now, if I tilt the book away, part at the bottom here is going to be closer and the part at the back will be further away. That will mean that the part at the back will be slightly darker. That's a demonstration to show you that it's really important that as I rotate the object in space, even though the light source didn't move, the book moved, the lighting is going to be different. So there's no one correct lighting for an object. It all depends on how that object is rotated in space. Let's look at an example by drawing it out. So in this example, I'm going to draw the light source represented by the sun. It's coming from the top left. Now I'll draw a line. That's going to be representing the book facing the light source. You can see that the book is evenly lit on the top side, the part that's facing the light source. When you think back to those 5 squares of different shades that you have, the part that is in direct light, the part that is directly beneath the light source is going to receive the number 1. So the face of the book will receive the lightest tone, tone number 1. Now the side of the book may receive a little bit of light, so let's call that a 3 or a 4. And the back cover doesn't get any light whatsoever, so it's going to be our darkest tone, number 5. It gets a little more complicated with a shape like an egg. Notice the part of the egg that is closest to the source of light. And as my finger goes across the egg, I move away from the direction of the light. It's going to get darker and darker. And then around the back side of the egg will be the darkest of all, because it's not in the direct light. Now if I turn the egg around, you can see that the part of the egg that's closest to me changes. It's the same idea with another shape, the cylinder. When the cylinder is held at a certain angle, there's a line that goes from the top all the way to the bottom of the cylinder that is closest to the light source. That will receive the lightest gray. All of the other grays, as you move away from the light source, will become darker and darker until you get to this side. So the part of the mug that will be closest to us will receive the lightest shade. And the parts on the side will get darker and darker. We can understand a little bit now about the shape of the object, but let's understand what happens when you rotate it in relation to the direction of the light. Let's start with the light source in the top left corner. These three lines each represent a book. The first book is going to be facing the light source, the second book at an angle, and the third book will not be facing the light source. Since the first book is completely perpendicular to the light source, it's all facing the light source, we're going to receive a number 1 shading, our lightest shade. Moving to the second book now, we see that the object is not directly facing the light source, so it's going to be slightly darker. This is going to be, it could be a 2 or a 3, but I'll put a 3 here. And for the last example, the book is not facing the light source whatsoever. It is parallel to the light source, and so the side of the book will be completely dark. This is number 5 or 4. So if you think you're comfortable with the concept of light sources and how that affects the object, and also how the object rotates in space and how that affects the shading, we can move on to step 3. Step 3 is the most important step. It is creating a light map. Making a light map is making a plan. It's a plan for shading. So how you do it is you start with a rough outline drawing of your object. Then you identify the parts of the drawing that will receive levels 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. In order to know what parts of the object get what number, you have to reference those first 2 observational skills that we were talking about. Number 1, where's the light source coming from? And number 2, how is the object rotated in space? Is it facing the light source or is it turned away from the light source? And also, what's the shape of the object? Is it round or flat? You see in this book I have 3 surfaces. The first surface will be facing the light source. It's going to receive number 1, the lightest. And the side will receive number 3. The part of the book that's not in the light source whatsoever will get number 5, the darkest shade. Let's try that again with a slightly more difficult object. Start with the light source in the same position in the top left. The part of the object that's closest to the light source, I've circled here, that's going to be number 1. Right beside number 1 is always number 2. And then 3, and about halfway down, you've reached the side of the ball. Everything past that point is going to be number 5, because there's no light. Don't worry right now about reflected light. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. Now we're going to try the same shape, but in this case we're going to have the light source in front and off to the side. I'm going to make concentric circles with number 1, the part that's closest to the light source, being the lightest. You'll see that the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are in different positions than they were in that first egg. That's because the light source has changed relative to the object. If I draw another egg in a different position, you can see that the number 1 spot also changes. It's much lower and to the right. It's the same thing with flat objects like a book. You see that 1, 3, 5 example that we saw before. If I rotated the book sideways, the number 1 would be in a position directly facing the light source. After you create your light map, of course, you have to shade it. There are a number of different ways to shade, and I'll be releasing a video very shortly about the 7 ways that I find most effective. But for now, I would recommend just using the side of your pencil, pressing very lightly, and building up the shade as you go. I like to start with the number 1 position and build up the shading as I move through 1, 2, 3, 4, and then finally finishing at 5. And that's just a personal preference. You could start dark and go light, or you could start in the middle. It's all up to you. Let's take a look at a more complicated light map. This is the case of a cylinder, but specifically it's a hollow cylinder, a mug. You can see that the light source is from the front and a little bit to the left. So I've marked out where the number 1 is. The number 2s are beside that, and the 3s then to 4. I have a little bit of 5 on the far right side of the mug. You can see that the hollow part of the cylinder is pretty much the same idea. I have a lighter part, and then beside that it gets slightly darker, and beside those I go to the number 4 and ultimately end up at the number 5. The 5 part of the inside of the cylinder is not facing the light source whatsoever. It's parallel to the light source. After I finish shading my mug using the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 pattern, you see that there are stripes on the mug. Now this is not exactly what you want. You want smooth transitions. And the reason you get these stripes is that we're only using 5 sample shades. But in reality, there are an infinite number of grays between white and black. So you'll just have to smooth them out with some light shading. Now I want to talk about an exception to our rules when it comes to shading. The exception is with reflected light. You're going to find that parts of the object that are not in the direct light whatsoever still are lighter than they should be. Well, that's because of reflected light. In this example, the part of the ball that I've labeled here, number 5, receives no direct sunlight whatsoever. But it does receive some reflected light. You can do this in your light map by having a line for the number 5 that represents the side of the ball. After that line, you're going to go back to number 4, and there's going to be a little spot in the middle that's number 3. This will give you the appearance of having a shine to your object. Your shadow will be a number 5, closest to the object, and then fading to a number 4. Now, just for fun, let's look at a translucent object. This is what the light map looks like for a translucent object. You see that the light hits at number 1. You go through 2, 3, and 4, but then it gets light again for the reflected light, all the way up to a 2. The shadow's a little bit different too for a translucent object. Instead of going 5 closest to the object and then to a 4, you actually start with a 3 and go out back to a 4 and then a 3 after that. If you consider yourself an absolute beginner to shading, I wouldn't worry too much about reflected light at this point. Just be aware that there is something called reflected light, and once you develop your observational skills, you're going to start noticing it, especially on rounded objects that are closer to walls or light tables. Now you know all about light sources, direction of light, objects facing the light, and how they change when they rotate, and most importantly, you know about light maps. I hope this really helps you with your shading. Happy drawing, and I'll see you in the next one.